Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel this afternoon. Regrettably, our chair has been delayed. Professor Serkku Hoila from University of Helsinki. So I'm Kathy Garner, and I'm currently with the World Capital Institute. So I'm going to just act as chair for the moment and introduce the panelists. Now, our panel this afternoon is all about reimagining cities for living in the Anthropocene. If you've been joining our sessions through the last few days, you'll know that cities are very much featured in everything we're doing. And we know that with the climate crisis that we're facing, cities will be under pressure and may actually be on the front line of the change that we need to have. So the purpose of the panel this evening is really to hear from people from around the world, from speakers from around the world, on their experiences of working in the whole area of climate change. And we have speakers this evening from the United States, from South Africa, from France and Brazil. So a really, really diverse panel, and I'm looking forward very much. Our first speaker this evening will be Lelana Minnetti. Lelana, can you join us now? Thank you, Lelana. Welcome.
Hi, thank you, Kathy, for that introduction.
Lelana is currently at the Urban Studies Institute in Georgia, USA, but maybe we want to just say a little bit more about your background and your speciality.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. I am Dr. Lelana Minnetti, and I am working on a National Science Foundation funded project that started off as the Urban Resilience to Extreme Events Sustainability Research Network, and that is morphing into the SETS Convergence Project. But more on that shortly. I wanted to kind of get us started by reiterating that this global challenge of extreme events that we are facing is increasing in magnitude, frequency, and duration due to climate change. In most cities, local governments are trying to adapt to these ever more severe events, even though local contexts vary, cities are increasingly needing to face these risks alongside the compounding effects of rapid urbanization, failing infrastructure, and growing social inequality. And in order to overcome these, cities essentially need to become more resilient. But what does it mean to be a resilient city? Well, cities are considered resilient when they can persevere, develop, and even transform while maintaining their function and identity. On your screen, you will see an aerial view of the mouth of the Miami River in the 1920s. It certainly doesn't look like that anymore, and it won't look like it does today in another 100 or 150 years. So, how can the city of Miami overcome rising sea levels alongside many other of the challenges that it is currently facing? How can your own city persist, grow, and even transform in response to the climate crisis? Well, in our experience, the key factors that can contribute to a city becoming resilient include some of them that you see on the screen there. The first one is multiple pathways. Pathways to resilience should include those such as persistence, such as engineering principles to resist disturbance while maintaining the status quo. They should also include transition pathways that allow cities to incrementally adapt to change, as well as transformation pathways that allow for radical change. Another factor is acknowledging temporal scale and the difference between resilience immediately after a disaster, for example, as well as longer term resilience that is needed for mitigation and adaptation. There are also times we find that when general resilience or an adaptability of the system itself is preferred over specified resilience. And most importantly, at least for me, is that resilience is framed as an explicitly desirable state. It's something that needs to be aspired to. Therefore, those that Therefore, the resilience needs to be negotiated among those that are expected to enact it empirically. But how do those that enact it frame resilience? Well, that is where we come in. As the Urban Resilience to Extreme Events Sustainability Network, or UREX SRN for short, we bring together researchers and practitioners with the goal of improving the resilience of cities as complex adaptive systems. We consider cities as social, ecological, and technological structures with various parts of the system, including institutions, ecosystems, buildings, communities, and all of them interacting across scales. One of our main priorities is to develop city-specific scenarios for sustainable, equitable, and resilient urban futures through what we call participatory scenario workshops. How we do this primarily depends on a forward-thinking, anticipatory futures approach. We start off with where we are now, then we collectively consider what our cities could be, and then we push the boundary by including the desirable aspects of what our cities should be. During these participatory scenario workshops, we bring together, like I said, practitioners, but also administrators, decision makers, civic and community organization leaders, designers, architects, professors, and students from the city and beyond. And then we collectively co-develop scenarios to adapt to future extreme events, but we also co-develop transformative scenarios that would aspire to radically change not only the city's infrastructure, but also its ability to respond to extreme events. Working in small groups, we start the day by looking at the historical and major events as well as decisions that have led the city to where they are today. We then ask them to consider what a resilient, sustainable, and just city would look like in the year 2100. Based on this, the group comes up with overarching goals and objectives that would need to be met so as to bring about the desired future. They then delve into these detailed strategies and actions that would be needed to achieve these objectives, asking where these strategies need to occur in their city. By when does it have to happen? Who needs to make it happen? What are the institutional barriers that need to be overcome? Who benefits, who loses, and so forth. Ending the day with a fun narrative where we ask them to consider what the city would look like for a person living in 2100. Now, we've co-developed multiple future scenarios, and you'll see some examples there from our Miami workshop. There are also various other products that were created and that are currently being analyzed. The co-produced outcomes being synthesized right now include the quantitative maps and visualizations and many other qualitative assessments. For example, our tool that assesses resilience, equity, and sustainability in particular. We also have reports for each city and a guide on how we plan and conduct these workshops, which I'm happy to share hereafter. But in terms of what is important for this panel discussion, I want to speak more on what else needs to be done to enable cities to meet these ambitious futures that they have collectively reimagined. Firstly, we need to do these types of exercises across multiple scales. Although we have at times conducted them at neighborhood as well as regional scales at the request of our city partners, we increasingly find that local governments want to position their visions beyond that of their city limits. We are also continuously diversifying who is at the table. Not only is the focus on multiple disciplines, but also on different ways of knowing and seeing the world. Also important is reflective learning, in that we go back to our cities during follow-up workshops and review and revise these co-developed scenarios. And then there is the fostering of transformative spaces, since any societal change needs to happen both at the collective as well as the individual level for us to be able to realize any of the futures that we have envisioned. And lastly, and this is my contribution to the book that we have all been working on, is that of downscaling agency, in that those that are expected to enact resilience should not only be the ones that frame resilience, but they also need to have the capacity, resources, and power to effect transformative change. I'll leave it there and hand back to you, Kathy.
Thank you very much. I think we're now going to, we'll come back to questions a bit later, if that's okay, and we'll look for some questions in the chat as well. But we're now going to go to Lorena, and Lorena Pasquini is an honorary research associate at the University of Cape Town, working with the Climate System Analysis Group. I hope that's correct, Lorena. And of course, coming from South Africa this evening. So welcome, Lorena. It's good to have you with us. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kathy. Yes, I'm a research associate at University of Cape Town. I work with the Climate System Analysis Group and with the African Climate and Development Initiative, as well as the Global Risk Governance Program. Although at the moment, my main day job is working for an NGO, and we do activism in the climate change space. So I'm going to talk from my experience working for the last 10 years as an academic, working on adaptation of cities to climate change and building resilience, particularly here in South Africa, but also in other African countries. I'm just going to start the slideshow, 1 second. There, hopefully that's working. All right, so first off, I wanted to consider some of the key challenges for cities in their resilience building efforts. I mean, obviously, there are many more challenges than we can really speak about in the course of the time that we have today. But I actually just wanted to talk about the way I conceptualize the challenges, which is a three different kind of levels. I mean, it is something of an arbitrary classification, but I find it useful as a way to think through the challenges that cities face. So, I mean, I work mostly with local governments, although they are only one of the various actors that are involved in city governance, they are still an important actor in the space of governance. And I work particularly at the individual level barriers. So what affects individuals in the execution of their roles? And a classic example that we have worked on a lot as climate change scientists is that of changing people's knowledge around climate change. But this is both less important nowadays with the amount of work that's done in the climate change space, and also less interesting to me because knowledge, while it's an important part of the behavior change picture, it's actually quite a small element. And there are other factors that affect whether or not people take action on climate change and resilience, which are, for example, the values that people operate from. Then there are, of course, a number of structural barriers that face local governments. These are regulatory and institutional type of barriers, so well known for cities struggling with climate change issues, and particularly so in developing countries, has always been financial constraints. There are legislative barriers. In South Africa, as one example, it's a country that has a very complex regulation governing environmental matters that assigns different responsibilities to different actors in quite conflicting and confusing ways. In some cases, legislation is absent. So at the moment, we're still waiting for government to pass the climate change bill. In others, it is unfunded. So there is a mandate to do something, but no funding for it, and so forth. And then there are also political system barriers. So a well-known problem are short-term electoral cycles, which don't work for dealing with long-term problems like climate change. And then political instability, which basically reinforces the short-termism of electoral cycles. And then there are what I think of as social cultural barriers. We might even call them socio-economic and cultural barriers. So, for example, social needs tend to trump environmental needs. And this is particularly, but not exclusively, the case in developing countries, because there is still a tendency to view environmental type issues like climate change as distinct from social. And this is related to societal values, which of course also are related to individual level values. And so really the overall point that I want to make is that the systems that we live in, all the way up from the individual level upwards, are not well set up to cope with the sort of long-term and self-transcending problem of climate change. And self-transcending means that it's looking outside of the self, so it's in opposition to self-enhancing. And so just to give a simple example, people really struggle to even look after their own health, which is something that cannot really be more in the interest of a person. So when people struggle to even manage their health, which we assume to be really in their immediate self-interest, it's quite hard, of course, for people and institutions to look further outwards than that and deal with something like climate change. This doesn't, of course, mean that there's no hope. While the system doesn't really favor us, there are factors that help in building city resilience. Again, I can't really talk about all of them in the context of this presentation, but just to talk about some key ones which relate in some ways to the book chapter that I contributed here. One, of course, that we know about is collaborative governance and knowledge sharing, which comes back to the old saying that if you want to go far, you have to go together. And this is really about creating and sustaining networks. I mean, climate change, as we know, is a multi-sectoral, multi-actor problem. It crosses boundaries of like time and space. And it is therefore a problem of such complexity that we know it can't be resolved by one actor alone, much less city governments. And so there is an important role for creating and sustaining networks which allow people to share important knowledge, but also, I think, importantly, to foster shared values, because we need people to come together around different values around climate change, and of course connects local governments to opportunities which are particularly important in developing countries which are particularly financially constrained. And so we see this in places in South Africa at a range of scales. I mean, Cape Town and Hessequart are, an example of a metropolitan municipality, respectively, and a very small rural municipality. But both of them have got good connections to local universities and are therefore recognized leaders on climate change issues. The question of how do we go around like creating and sustaining networks is something that I'm going to address later when we come back to the question time. But one other really important factor that I don't think gets talked about enough is the question of changing people's mindsets and behaviors, which consist in changing their underlying values. It's something that in the governance space is not talked about much. It relates particularly to individual level barriers, which is why I have such an interest in them. But it is, it's if we want to change the system we live in, we're also going to have to change the values by which we live and also the behaviors that we undertake. And in the climate change space, there's been some success in doing so with projects that show demonstrability of benefits. So in other words, particularly in contexts like the local South, where where social needs are seen to trump environmental needs, it's particularly important for projects to show that they have outcomes, which then fosters like a different way of thinking about things. So in the city of Durban, there's a project called Shikamvinzelo, which relies on getting local communities to take ownership of cleaning the streams where they live. I mean, this is partly for ecological restoration purposes, but also because they remove waste and alien invasives, but it increases water to the city, it protects infrastructure, they report erosion to the local municipality and help fix small erosion. And it's a model that works quite successfully, and communities that participate in it have seen the benefits in terms of important benefits like improved health from having cleaner water, but also in things that we wouldn't necessarily always think about as the most important, like recreational opportunities. But these are important for local communities who have so little, and it increases safety because alien invasive vegetation provides a lot of opportunity for criminals to hide, and safety and security is a big issue, particularly in townships in South Africa. So these kind of benefits like really have demonstrable values to communities and change the way they think about, for example, in this particular case, about water courses. And I see that I'm getting close to running out of time, which is fine. So what I wanted to finish with is, what more do we need to do? Again, there is so much that can be done, but the thing I really wanted to focus on was the importance of experimentation. And to some extent, we have a lot of research and we have a lot of knowledge. We have enough to know that the world is on a path for destruction, really. Sounds all very positive, and I sound like I'm belonging to a cult that's foretelling the end of the world. But the reality is that the future is not looking rosy, and we really need, and we know enough to know that it's not looking rosy. And so we really need to move towards experimenting with different solutions. Perhaps time for time for less talk, more practice, and this requires experimenting, because we don't know what's going to work, and we also have to be comfortable with failure, because the problem is the world isn't very kind on failed attempts, but it's the only way that we're going to learn what will and won't work, and therefore we also need to restructure our systems to be encouraging not just of innovation but also of failed attempts. And I think that's where I want to leave it for today. So I'm going to hand back to you, Kathy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating to hear those live examples there from South Africa, and I too share the. Sorry, I'm getting a back. I too share the idea that if we try things, we must assume that we may get failure, but that we have the mechanisms to actually experiment and try that. So really interesting. Again, Lorena, we'll come back for questions to all the panel. But in the meantime, if that's okay, we will move on to our next speaker, who is Raphael, who is currently in France. And Raphael, hello. And you're the founder of the LIID, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, Futures Lab, a hybrid research platform in Paris. So, Raphael, I'll hand over to you now. If that's...
Thank you, Katie. Let me share my screen. Okay. And then... Can you see well my slides?
Yes, we can see well.
Okay, perfect. So also thank you very much for this great invitation. I'm very happy to get a chance to say a few words on the chapter I wrote for the publication that gathers us here today. So my article is called Fostering a Resilient Co-learning ecosystem in the city. So today I'm going to share with you some of the previous research that I made that led to that article. So it's more like an introduction to this chapter, and that will give me an occasion also to say a few words about foresight research, which is slightly different from academic research. So the Lead Future Lab, it's a hybrid foresight research platform that I created like almost 20 years ago now. And foresight is about exploring the future. So you cannot demonstrate the future. It's not an academic research where you demonstrate and you give a proof. You design possible futures, and those futures can take different shapes. They can take the shape of a scenario, just like Lelani mentioned also, as like being a group of designing possible futures and favorite futures. You can also look at the future and try to map possible trends that will serve as a kind of guidance for more sophisticated scenarios. So to design and to understand what are the current trends, you look at what you call weak signals, and weak signals are emerging practices innovations, sometimes fairly underground practices that shows possible futures. So this kind of future research is quite speculative. As I said, you don't demonstrate the future, you show possible path for the future. And one of my favorite mode of research is looking at weak signal, and from those weak signal, highlight possible trends, and those trends can serve to support strategies. So I've done future research with that method on the future of cities, of the future of campuses, and on the future of urban resilience. That was already in 2016, but I will come back on that specific research. That was one of the important steps behind that article. Then another key research I made was on the future of the Greater Paris, Paris becoming the Greater Paris. And that specific research showed how creative hubs, which are cultural places with hybrid practices, and what you call third spaces, if you look at them as a constellation over the city, maybe they can be pivotal places to organize systemic change, as places where you can make a convergence between top-down dynamics and bottom-up dynamics. So that's another important learning from that specific research. And then the third part that led to that article is a more recent series of articles I wrote last year during the COVID crisis. I was invited by a newspaper to write a tribune as a foresight professional on what could be solution to tackle the COVID crisis. And I came up with that idea that it was really the very beginning of the COVID crisis. And it was a moment where all the kids were shifting to distance schooling. And at the same time, everybody was stopping to work because the entire activity would slow down. And I had suddenly just one idea of maybe we could use that suspended time to actually learn together to engage into a real Green New Deal. And suddenly, so I wrote that it's more like a spontaneous vision and an article. But with that article, it led to a series of publication, and with a European think tank, we even made an open letter to EU representative. So it had a whole chain of impact, just as, taking the focus on learning as something that could help to sort the COVID crisis and the climate crisis at the same time. So that article that I wrote for the publication is a mixture of those three different researches. So you can look at all those articles online. They're very easy to find. And so now I'm going to share some reflection on urban resilience. So urban resilience now, there is a consensus about, everybody is willing to engage in a resilience process. And now we see, and Lelana actually gave a very good definition. I'm very close to her proposition of saying like resilience is about protecting our environment, protecting our society. It's about repairing, it's about empowering, and it's about transforming the city to reach a level of sustainability and really change our society and our cities. Now there is a fairly consensual definition of resilience, and you can see, for instance, in the last OECD report, it's very often resilience is shown as a three-dimensional process. One dimension is looking at green solution and an ecological approach of like pollution, mobility, sustainable production, sustainable consumption, green lifestyles. So the ecology is the first movement as part of the ecology. The second is socioeconomic inclusion and equity, because you can't do sustainability without having a concern for social equity. And so the second force in that resilience engine is social inclusion, and now more and more associated with economic sustainability, socioeconomic, as there is no possible sustainability if there is not a form of generativity and economic sustainability to be empowered. And the third dimension is governance, which is like really about like defining new governance model, new collaborative governance model. And those three pillars are what you see in most of our current studies and articles about urban resilience. You also have that urban resilience in the back of the new Green New Deal policies, which also emphasize more also the necessity to have top-down and bottom-up dynamics, and that this dual dynamic is really necessary. You cannot have just a governance top-down approach. You need to engage with local ecosystems and communities, and the two previous presentation showed very good example of that. But it's still like we're still looking for possibilities to actually engage in that systemic transformation, which is not so easy. And I have a tendency that we should more speak of an ecosystemic transformation rather than just a systemic transformation. Ecosystemic being more fluid and multidimensional. So this is like the standard definition. In the urban resilience foresight research that I had a chance to work on a few years ago, we tried to. I was with we built a team for that. It was like commissioned by it was part of our future think tank. I'm also collaborating on a regular basis with, and the four pillars that we showed in that research is that there is no possible future resilience by adding other dimension to that resilience. So the first pillar was also the ecological dimension. The second one was also the social dimension. But then instead of focusing only on governance, we showed that future resilience can happen only when there is a collaborative resilience between all stakeholders in the city, not just coming from the governance, because collaborative resilience can come also from innovation ecosystem, from private stakeholders, from artistic communities. And so there is a very diverse approach of that collaborative resilience, and this is, in fact, the pivotal sequence in the success of resilience. And that's in that study we showed also that there is no possible cultural resilience without a cultural dimension, where we go at the level of shared imaginaries and on mindset, and when there is not a concern for memory. Lelani, I remember you mentioned also the point of preserving identities. We can also reinvent identities by bridging memory with future vision. And so it's really important to also have in the resilience plan a concern for cultural resilience and this emotional relation to the urban space and the sensorial. We see with the COVID how it's important it is to feel safe in the city, to actually engage in it. So this is like the learning from that study. And so now I'm just going to I think I have like 4 minutes left. It's perfect. I can give some insight about this article, which gives a little bit that cross learning of all this different research. And so the point of this article was to explore a possible future scenario that would be engaging, fostering resilience, urban resilience, by focusing really on where is the learning and the co-learning, where that can engage and really activate that resilience in a very soft way with that ecosystemic perspective. And when I say about learning, it's not so much about focusing on education. It's really also looking at how there is learning and co-learning in many places. It's really important because nowadays with the green transition, we need new knowledge. We cannot be only the best expert on circular economy and not necessarily in the academia. They can be also in informal networks. And it's really important to really zoom on where is this key knowledge for the transition and the resilience. So the point of this article was also to show many weak signals and best practices from everywhere around the world that show where are those co-learning and what are the most that create the best impact toward resilience. And so the article is organized in 3 parts. You have like one part with weak signal that really shows where are those new knowledge toward low carbon lifestyle solution and production. So this can be as much as in, for instance, the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, but it can be also in the Fab Cities network. It can be in local communities. So the first part taking is also that first part is coming back on that sustainability knowledge. The second part is focusing on the socio-economic generativity. So I'm changing a little bit the focus on not being only on the social inclusion, but really in that dual dynamic of how learning can be really the base to also create inclusion, empowerment, entrepreneurship, and value creation. Really having this chain of reaction, starting from learning and co-learning, but also creating that movement of transformation. And the third part is showing plenty of example and best practices from around the world, showing how in the creative places and the cultural places, there are creative and learning communities that are actually engaging in this transformation and that are embedding the transformation, because creative communities, they're not mobilized just for one action. They exist, they are persistent, they are there. They are not just like for one event, they are engaged on a longer run, and also they are maybe creating a counterbalancing from also the digital transition that has a tendency to bring us all even more on the web. And we see that for learning, the web is fantastic, but maybe with the focus on creative places and creative communities and learning through creativities in specific places, first, we see that the learning is actually much more efficient, and we have like really clear articles showing that learning in a creative environment makes students even more engaged, and the impact of learning is much more favorable. And also we see that learning in this kind of creative environment is much more appropriate to open and support a future empowerment. And so in this article, I'm showing also how taking a future perspective can be extremely empowering and stimulating toward that resilience. And then in the conclusion of the article, I'm also going deeper on what are those hybrid places, which are actually pivotal places for this ecosystemic transformation. And those hybrid places, we see that nowadays they are in the process of developing which I called permaconomics. That's something I coined in another future research. And those hybrid places, if they find their autonomous economic model, they become pillar for the urban transformation. And the economy of learning is actually pivotal for their success. And we see many third places, community centers, incubators, creative hubs. All those terms are actually becoming places that find their sustainability by becoming learning places. So it's really interesting to see how that angle of learning can also show ways of finding sustainability for more fragile practices. And then in the end, I'm coming back on that notion of urban constellation, which can be a way of modelizing urban systems in a kind of fluid way. That's something I've tried to promote also, how to design quite fluid system, and constellation can be a good way of showing local constellation connected to international communities, international networks, and this dual dynamic of local communities, local network, local constellation can be very easily bridged through the web to international constellation. And my reflection is part also on a reflection on cosmolocalism, which is developed by researcher on urban commons, for instance, Michel Bowens and Javier and Jose Ramos, for instance. So I'm going to stop here. Thank you for your attention, and I hope I haven't, I've taken a couple of minutes extra, but I hope this is fine for you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to exchanging with my colleagues.
Thank you, Raphael. We'll forgive you for those 2 minutes. Don't worry. A very rich, another rich, very rich presentation. I can't wait till we get on to our discussions, actually. But we have one more presentation to come from Tatiana, and I'm sure that will add another dimension, although I'm picking up quite a lot of threads that I think we can bring together in the presentation. So Tatiana, we're looking forward to hearing from you. And thank you. And I have now lost your bio. Very good. Tatiana, you're one of our colleagues at the World Capital Institute, so you and I know each other very well. And you're a PhD student at the Santa Catarina Federal University in Florianópolis, Brazil. So Tatiana, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, for the introduction, and good day to all. And thank you also for jumping in as chair. So I'm a PhD student in engineering and knowledge management at UFSC in Florianópolis, Brazil. My research is to reconsider current institutional structures with the development of governance and planning based on knowledge management supported by active citizen participatory mechanisms and sustainable practices. So let me share my screen, Chrome tab, share, wait. Right. Hopefully you can see that. So I would like to bring some insights from Florianópolis, which majority of its territory is in an island, and yet it is the capital of Santa Catarina state. So from my studies and experience, I learned that co-production is among the key factors needed in building resilience. Co-production in being listening to citizens and understanding them not only as client or consumers, but them being actively involved as partners in providing a particular service or solution. I would also include co-creation as a step further in this process, but from this study, I would stick to co-production. But I'm very happy to listen a lot of calls in all the other presentations. And I think this is all interconnected, and I'm very glad about this. And right, so I will draw from an activity held by a Smart City research group aiming at producing city actors' engagement in finding solutions to a local problem, which was a chaotic, well, it still is, mobility in the island. And a window of opportunity had opened then because of this iconic bridge that is called Ponte Hercílio Luz. It's something like Eiffel Tower for Paris. And this bridge, which is a common good, connects the island to the continent, and it was going to be reopened after 28 years. So we decided to make this 1 week immersive workshop with over 50 participants from different sectors to identify innovative solutions of usage for this bridge and its surroundings. So we listened a lot of stakeholders, and a lot of great and innovative ideas came out from this experience, and one of them was the use of the bridge only for people and bicycles. This was the inauguration day, so everybody was very happy and thrilled to have this new equipment for the city and a place for to cross and bike and all. But what happened is that gave way to include public transportation, and nowadays it gave way to car usage as well. So this reinforced our findings, which are our key challenges as well, that the state policy does not reflect the common well-being of the population and the precarious communication between actors involved, being public and private entities and dwellers association and civil society. So in order to address some of these challenges, also a collaborative initiative led by the municipality of Florianópolis was put together for a joint action to qualify a public park that is over here. That is a small park, but it's the only actual park of downtown area, and this is very close to the bridge over here. And the idea was to listen and understand the park's users and non-visitors' interests and needs. So the idea, and we were like over 2 years of listening and group meetings, observations and questionnaires and interventions. So it was a lot of work. And that made me know about these key factors in building resilience. One, that is the multidisciplinary group, the importance of having different points of view, like urban planners, environmentalists, researchers, and dwellers all together. Understanding about the local knowledge and trying to tailor the generic approach to the local situations and the way the people live their lives. It was visible that important of a mobilizing aspect of urban smartness is actually people, and technology is really just a mean in this initiative. And the direct relationship between citizen participation and public policy. The voluntary disposition of these people contributed to the construction of public policies, and this is all lead to one of the persons that has been inspiring my work, that is Elinor Ostrom, when she claims that no government can be efficient and equitable without considerable input from citizens. So, but what happens is that only this input is not enough. The thing about co-producing and the co-production being evidenced and reinforced continuously, not only by engagement of these actors, but also putting actions into practice, because only personal motivation is not going to guarantee co-production. I believe also that in order for us to get scale, and technology must jump in order to facilitate integration between systems, infrastructures. And the last but the most important one is that we noticed already also the lack of participation of the people. I mean, it wasn't something that was very easy to gather everybody and different opinions. I mean, so we haven't been into a very culture of participation and inclusion and practice of collaborative work, prioritizing collective over individual interests. And this is something that really needs to be worked upon. And as my colleagues were saying before, experience and practice is something that actually is the only way to go forward on this matter. So, and this relates to something else that has not been included in this equation here, and for far too long, which is breaking out of the bubble, and especially with traditional and indigenous people and knowledge. I mean, I guess this picture of Kaingangi speaks for itself. He is one of the leaders of the indigenous Brazilian people representing us at the indigenous people at the COP26. And if it's not too late, maybe the European Commission has finally managed to pull out a positive action. Yesterday, it was announced a proposal for a regulation on deforestation-free products. So maybe we have a quicker turnaround on current scenario, but I believe this is something that we need to be spreading on our work and our policies and our way of doing things from now on. Thank you, and back to you, Kathy.
Thank you, Tatiana. Thank you. What a wonderful picture to end with. That was fabulous and wonderful. Now we've got a lot of emerging questions in the chat here. I hope, can we have everyone to join us now? Have we got Lorena as well? Yeah, great. I know, Lorena, you're having some connection problems, so you may not come on your video all the time. And just to say, I've heard from Sirku. She has unfortunately had a massive outage on her electricity, so she wasn't able to join us. I don't know whether it is caused by climate effects, but she is trying to join us, and if not, she will be on the other chat. So we may see some questions from her, and sends her best wishes to everyone. Now, we had arranged to do some follow-up questions, but we do have a real raft of questions in the chat. I know some of you have responded, but I think if you're all happy, I'd quite like to take some from the chat, and we can follow up on the other questions from a bit later if we have time. Lorena, are you able to come in? I have one here from Javier Carrillo that I think would be really interesting. He's asking if you can share how your activism nourishes or enlightens your research. Good, it come up on the screen.
Thank you for the question. That's actually a little difficult to answer at this stage, because I have been with my NGO for only about 4 months. I actually decided that I'd rather, well, not rather, but after 10 years and as an academic, I guess I felt like it was maybe time to leave academia and move into the practice world, because of this, the urgency of the problem that confronts us. And as I said, I personally feel, all research is good and more research is good, but at the moment I feel that maybe what the world is lacking is action. So it's been a bit early to say how my activism has influenced my research. I would say that rather my research has influenced my activism. Rather at this stage. I'm also finding myself in a completely different space. I have been working in adaptation for the last 10 years, and now I'm mostly working in mitigation. So yeah, ask me again in a year's time, and I think I'll have a better answer for you.
Fabulous, Lorena, that's great. And we're delighted to see you, Serku. Welcome.
My sincerest apologies, and I don't want to take up any time explaining why I had such huge connection issues. I don't want to take up time from the speakers. I'm just so sorry that I wasn't there in the beginning. So please carry on. Carry on, and thank you, Kathy, for taking over.
No problem. We seem to have some background noise when you're speaking.
That again.
Yeah, really bad. So we'll carry on, but pleased to see you, and I'm glad you've been able to connect. So maybe we could have a move on to another question. Tatiana, for you, I see one from Velina. For the knowledge we need, how do we make sure, for the important points on citizens and citizenship and civil society, she thanks you. And we might have all the knowledge we need, but how do we make sure that they are actually valued and acted on?
Right. Thanks, Velina. And I'm not sure. I'm not sure we have them. We know that they are there, but we are not including this knowledge in our systems, in our policies, in our way of even thinking. This year was the first time we had over 40 representatives from indigenous people at COP26. And the year before it was not even 20, but only now that these issues are being actually addressed. So I think there is no other way rather than including this point of view, like nature point of view, indigenous people point of view, in everything we do, in all the projects that we are carrying on, really.
Thank you. Lelana, I know that you have answered some questions in the side, but to share with everyone, just to say from Monica, do people need the experience that other strategies are possible and joyful in order to believe that the current situation can actually change?
They don't necessarily, and thank you for that question, Monica. I don't think they necessarily need the experience, but they do need that experience of envisioning it with other people, hearing other voices and other perspectives, and then putting it alongside other scenarios, whether that is business as usual or an inclusion of maybe, let's say, something a compounding event were to happen, to think of things, on another level, not just this linear level. So it's not necessarily about experience of how the strategies are possible, but just being in that space, that transformative space, and discussing it and going back and forth with others, I think makes a difference. And then again, the possible and joyful aspect of it, especially during that narrative, also just gives it another spin on what is possible. And then they view things and they're more encouraged. They then become, well, you'll hear often at the end of the day, they would say that when they walked into the workshop, they probably were a little bit despondent, knowing what is in the future, but afterwards they felt a little bit more energized, although they just spent all these hours working on this. So yeah, probably they do need that back and forth with others in the room.
Great. I can see Raphael nodding vigorously there. So Raphael, do you want to come in and make a point on this? And Serku, I saw you nodding as well, so maybe you would like to pop in too, if we can. But Raphael first, if you can.
Yeah, I'm fully aligned with what you just said, because that's something really interesting about the future. When you make people explore the future, it's really interesting the mental effect it creates. It's not the impact is not necessarily an immediate efficiency, but the exercise of looking at the future, of engaging in that research of what are the possible, do we like it, we don't like it. Oh, by the way, we need to learn this, we need to read this. So it's actually very stimulating exercise because it makes people learn. And that's why I'm also introducing like futures literacy, which is like a movement I'm part of, as part of this learning process. Co-learning with the future can be extremely efficient because it makes people learn. And it makes people have a lot of ideas. It stimulates creativity. And so the moment people have participated in an exercise of looking at the future, they are engaged. They are on board. And maybe they will not necessarily do the exact plan that was mentioned in the workshops, but the fact that they took part of it put them on the boat. And it's a very interesting kind of like tacit effect on future research. It makes people learn, it stimulates creativity and engagement. So I'm someone who is like, I'm really preaching for the use of the future for systemic transformation.
Serki, do you want to try to come in?
So sure, if the noise quality is good enough.
It's good now.
Okay, good. I haven't had a chance to listen to all the presentations, but of course I've seen your slides beforehand. And one thing that I have this sort of general question that maybe if all the panelists can weigh in on. You all bring together very nice examples of different kinds of tools and processes that we can start this kind of change and of more inclusion, etc. If you think now 10 years ahead, how do we know that we're on the right path? What kinds of tools and things can we sort of use to sort of see that we're moving in the right direction? So let's say we are having this panel in 10 years' time. How do we look back and say, okay, we did the right choices? What do we need to sort of constantly check and measure that we're going in the, not necessarily measure in the numerical sense, but how do we know that we're moving in the right direction? You all have very good examples of that. Maybe you can reflect on that.
I can start. I think there is no way we can know, and this is the point. And I think this is all about being kind of okay with the fact that we don't know. There is no way we can demonstrate that what we're doing is leading us exactly where we're planning to go. We'll have a constant adaptation. There will be new solution coming along the road. And so it's really a step by step. So that's why I'm really speaking of like ecosystemic perspective, ecosystemic change, where we are in a kind of fluid transformation. We do our best. We'll pick at the best example. We experiment, we take risk, but taking risk is also being okay with the fact that we don't know what is going to be the exact result. And that navigation with uncertainty is really part of what we need to kind of learn today, of being like, yeah, I mean, we're making plans and we do our best, and hopefully we'll arrive at the right point. And this is the whole point.
Lelana, do you want to come in? And then Tatiana? Lorena, of course, I'm not seeing you, but I think you may wish to come in too.
I love the way that Raphael just framed that. And I would like to add, beyond being fluid and flexible, and Lorena mentioned it, that safe to fail. It's okay, you know, accepting the failures. There has to be a social learning. I think that also has to happen. I don't want to use the word we have to measure social learning, but we do then have to look back in terms of how we have collectively responded to these challenges. And again, and on that point, Raphael also framed that we're talking about it now as collaborative governance, but it really has to be, as she said, collaborative resilience of us growing together, building on these communities of practice, and then maybe then looking back and then collectively reflecting on our 10 years, as Serku said it, or whatever time period we have kind of gone forward.
Tatiana, you want to come?
Right. Yeah, and I was thinking also about how Bhutan was measuring its improvement by looking at how people were happier in a broader sense, and maybe we can also learn a little bit from how they were measuring their index, and I think I've listened and learned that they are trying to open a little bit more in order to exchange all the knowledge that they have gathered all these years. And because we have economic markets still running and they want to measure things, so we could maybe start addressing and changing this measure and this bar that is not neither it's not reflecting anything, as we have been listening to from the other panels and speakers. So I think we can learn with other cultures as well, and improve our lens of looking at how we are interacting, not only in our environment but broader than this.
Can I allow Lorena to come in, Raphael? For a moment. Thank you. You're on mute, Lorena.
Sorry about that. It's not a Zoom call if somebody doesn't talk while they're on mute.
Correct.
It's also not a Zoom call if the cat's not crashing the party either.
Oh, I'll bring mine in a minute.
I just wanted to say, I think in 10 years' time, we'll know if we're in the right path, if the problems that people are facing are less. Are our populations less at risk? Are they less vulnerable? Are they suffering less damage? I mean, maybe this is an example of like how the activism is influencing me, but the activists out there, especially the ones who work at the grassroots, they've got their finger on the pulse on what people are suffering. So are people going to be suffering less from the impacts of climate change or more? And I think that will tell us whether we're doing better or worse.
Great. Serku, you asked the question. Do you want to come back? I want to pick up a question in the chat in a minute as well.
No, I think just as a quick response to all the answers, I think absolutely sort of agree with this need to understand that we don't necessarily know, that there will be uncertainty, and that we just have to sort of try to experiment, but that there is a real way in the real world, like Lorena just ended with, to see if we're actually, if situation continues to worsen for many, many people, which there is a real potential for that to happen, I think then, we have to continuously adjust. And so it's, real people and their lives that we're looking at. So I think that's good. But please go ahead, Kathy.
Oh, thank you. I want to come to a question from Gunther Koch. Learning by doing, learning by failing, learning by experiment has come up in quite a lot of the presentations. And Gunther is asking, do we need some new formal systems of learning? He gets the impression that many of these different things should be organized. Isn't it better to leave some of these things to social meetings, or do we formalize them into learning? There's the question now.
I can answer because learning has been was like the thread I took, and yeah, in the conclusion of like doing that, building that systemic perspective, the conclusion of that article that is in the book, I'm concluding on the fact that yes, if we look at all those new forms of learning, co-learning, learning and doing, learning and innovating, learning and including, learning and everything, in the end, it feels it's a little bit like what is work nowadays, where there is some kind of like a little bit of a melting of what we call work. We don't know so well what is work anymore. When work becomes very informal, there is something that is a little bit diluting, and learning is, and Gunther comments is very much touching on that question of like, are we sure it's still learning, or is it something else? Should it be framed and formalized, or should it remain informal and spread out in the society? And it's a true question. I have a tendency to think that in the article, I've been trying to show that the learning can also be seen as an economy, and it's sometimes the possibility for certain people to start initiating an economy by being teaching as much as learning. And so I've been trying to promote also the possibility that through those learning ecosystem, it's a support to economy. And in this case, it means that learning is kind of framed. And I'm concluding with that. If we frame it, it can enter like knowledge markets, and I'm quoting Javier Carrillo with this concept of knowledge markets, or it falls into the knowledge commons, which remains community-based and informal. And it's really the critical point. And it's really on the line just in between. And do we push learning towards something that can become reframed and monetized, or do we push it in the direction of informal and non-monetized practices? And it's really on the thread, and this is a true political question, to my opinion.
Anyone else want to add? We're running out of time, I'm afraid. We're very near the end, and I'd love to give Sergio, I don't know if you've got some things you wanted to say. I know you were. So I'd like to, in a sense, give you the final words.
Well, my closing comments were about to sort of thank the presenters, and I'm sure you have done an excellent job. So I can't really summarize the presentations, but maybe more just to sort of to stress the importance of the topic, just in the light of the COP. I mean, we're looking at it just in terms of impacts of climate change. We're not too far from causing irreversible damage to many ecosystems, and also those that are connected to sort of well-being of people. And I think it's very sort of encouraging to see these. Just because I've seen the presentation slides beforehand, to see these examples and the type of movement that there is to address these issues. And it can be sort of easy to be maybe somewhat pessimistic in the light of all the evidence that we have, but then I'm also always encouraged by these types of panels and brave people doing incredibly interesting research, and also taking it to the practical and making sure that things are changing in different parts of the world. So I'm hopeful, and that was going to be my final message. I hope that fits the panel.
Well, I think that's absolutely brilliant, because some of the words that I've got circled here are hope, learning to action, and action being a key one that comes up. And I think, having taken us through a number of paths on resilience, I think we have found areas of real value in each and every one of the presentations. And I really can't thank you enough. I think it's been a very, very rich set of presentations. I would love to go on forever, but I know that I've got a cat howling at the door, looking for his supper, and maybe a husband as well, I don't know. But it's been a wonderful, wonderful session. And Serku, thank you for making the effort to find somewhere you could get connected. I hope it wasn't a climate change effect that knocked your connection out. But these happen every day, and thank you. I'm so pleased to have seen you. Thank you, each and every one. It's been a brilliant thing, and I'd just say thank you to everyone again. And that's us for the end now. But thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well.
And thank you, Kathy, for stepping in when clearly a chair was needed. So thank you.
Well, it's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.